So here's a question for you. How does a nation, a powerhouse that made up a quarter of the entire world's economy, end up becoming a colony? It's an incredible story, really. It's about commerce, sure, but it's also about conspiracy and eventually outright conquest. It's the story of how a simple trading company twisted itself into an imperial power. Today, we're going to break down the anatomy of the British Empire in India and see exactly how it all happened. Take a look at this painting. It was commissioned for the headquarters of the East India Company, and it tells you everything you need to know about how they want it to be seen. You've got Britannia, the symbol of Britain, looking all regal while a submissive India literally offers up her jewels and riches. It was pure propaganda, a romantic vision of a kind, generous empire. But the reality? Well, the reality was a whole lot messier and infinitely more brutal. So let's start at the beginning. What was it that drew European powers halfway across the globe to India in the first place? What was the big attraction? Well, the answer is pretty simple: unimaginable, staggering wealth. You see, for centuries, India wasn't just a player in global trade, it was a central hub. We're talking spices that were literally worth more than their weight in gold, gems that were the stuff of legend, and the textiles? The textiles were something else. Impossibly fine muslins, rich, shimmering silks. They were wanted by everyone, everywhere. This was not some undeveloped backwater waiting to be discovered. This was a sophisticated, thriving manufacturing center of the world. I want you to just let that number sink in for a minute. 25%. That means 1/4 of everything produced, everything made, everything traded in the entire world came from India. Now, just to give you some context, Britain's share at the same time, it was less than 2%. So you can see why this immense prosperity made India an absolutely irresistible prize for those ambitious European nations, all looking to expand their power and fill their vaults. So how on earth did this all happen? How did a bunch of merchants become rulers? Well, the British didn't show up with a massive invasion force, not at first. Instead, their conquest was led by a private company, a corporation that would somehow end up ruling an entire subcontinent. The English East India Company was basically a joint stock company, kind of like a modern corporation you'd see on the stock market. But, and this is a huge but, its royal charter from the Queen gave it some very unusual powers. Powers like the right to wage war, to sign treaties, and to have its own private army. So they started small. They set up little trading posts in coastal cities like Surat and Madras, always keeping up the appearance of being simple merchants. It was a slow, patient approach that let them get their hooks into India without anyone really noticing the danger. This right here, this was the heart of the British playbook. You have to remember, India back then wasn't one single unified country. It was a complex patchwork of different kingdoms and princely states. The company's agents became masters at playing these rulers against each other. They'd exploit old rivalries, they'd meddle in succession disputes, offering their military muscle to one side in exchange for, you guessed it, trading rights and land. They didn't have to conquer everyone at once. They just had to be clever enough to tip the scales in their own favor, one conflict at a time. And the Battle of Plassey is the absolute classic example of this strategy in action. The company's man, Robert Clive, was facing the massive army of the Nawab of Bengal. On paper, he should have been crushed. But Clive didn't win with brilliant tactics. No, he won with a secret deal. He conspired with the Nawab's own commander, a man named Mir Jafar, promising to make him the new ruler if he just helped out. So on the day of the battle, Mir Jafar and his huge portion of the army did nothing. They just stood and watched. It handed a shocking victory and the keys to the vast treasury of Bengal straight to the British. And once they got that first real foothold, they developed some very clever, very insidious policies to expand their control. First, you had these subsidiary alliances. They'd go to an Indian prince and offer him protection. This meant stationing British troops in his kingdom, which, of course, the prince had to pay for. It was basically a protection racket on an imperial scale. And then you had the doctrine of lapse. This was a rule they just made up, which said that if a ruler died without a direct male heir, his kingdom would be automatically annexed by the British. It completely ignored the age-old Indian tradition of adopting a successor. It was, quite literally, conquest by paperwork. This rapidly expanding empire was built on a foundation of immense profit for the British, but for the people of India, it came at an almost unimaginable cost. What was once called a paradise on earth was about to experience hell. Just a few years after that victory at Plassey, the company's rule directly led to the catastrophic Bengal famine of 1770.
You see, they jacked up taxes to brutal levels and demanded payment in cash, no matter what the harvest was like. So when the crops failed, farmers had nothing. The result was starvation on a scale that is hard to comprehend. An estimated 10 million people, that's nearly a third of the entire population of the region, starved to death. And all the while, the company kept collecting its taxes, in some cases even raising them on the survivors.
This horrible, gut-wrenching contradiction became a repeating pattern of British rule. I mean, look at this. On one side, you have bags of grain piled high on the docks in Madras, ready to be shipped off to Britain. This is 1877. And on the other side, the victims of the famine that was raging in that very same region. Food was being exported from a starving land. This wasn't a one-off mistake. Again and again, the administration prioritized profit and exports over feeding its own subjects. It's a policy that directly led to tens of millions of deaths across multiple famines. Okay, so the sheer scale of the money taken out of India, it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. There's this economist, Utsa Patnaik, who did the math. She calculated that Britain systematically drained the equivalent of, wait for it, $45 trillion from India. In today's money, $45 trillion. You know, a lot of historians now argue that this massive transfer of wealth, this plunder, is what actually paid for Britain's Industrial Revolution. The very factories that would then turn around and destroy India's own industries were, in a way, built with Indian money. This quote, it's just haunting. It comes from a British Governor-General, and it perfectly captures the deliberate destruction, the deindustrialization of India. Britain wanted India to be two things: a cheap source of raw materials like cotton, and a captive market for all the stuff their new factories were making. So they slapped heavy taxes on Indian textiles to make them uncompetitive, while at the same time flooding the Indian market with cheap machine-made cloth from places like Manchester. Generations of skilled Indian weavers and artisans were driven into absolute poverty. Their world-renowned industry was systematically dismantled. So, after a century of this, a century of exploitation, of lost kingdoms, of cultural arrogance, all that simmering resentment across India finally boiled over. It exploded in a massive, violent uprising that would shake the British Empire to its very core. The causes had been building for decades. You had princes who'd had their kingdoms stolen by the doctrine of lapse. You had peasants who were being crushed by impossible taxes. And you had this general feeling that Indian culture and religion were constantly being disrespected. The final spark, the thing that lit the fuse, was a rumor about the new Enfield rifle. The cartridges for this rifle had to be bitten open by the soldiers, and the rumor was that they were greased with pig and cow fat, an insult to both Muslim and Hindu soldiers, or sepoys, who served in the company's army. For so many, this was the absolute last straw. And what's amazing is how diverse the leadership of this rebellion was. This wasn't just some mutiny of angry soldiers. You had incredible figures like Rani Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi and Begum Hazrat Mahal of Oudh. These were formidable queens who literally took up arms and led their armies into battle to defend the kingdoms that had been stolen from them. They became these incredibly powerful, unifying symbols of resistance, rallying thousands of people to their cause. The rebellion raged across northern India for over a year. But in the end, it was crushed. The rebels lacked a single unified command, and they were up against the superior military power of the British Empire. And the British response was swift and unbelievably brutal. But even in failure, the uprising was a massive turning point. The British government in London was so shocked by the scale of the revolt that they decided the East India Company couldn't handle it anymore. They dissolved the company and took direct control of India in 1858. This was the beginning of the British Raj. The rebellion was over, but the seed of a unified freedom struggle had been planted. So what was the result of all this? Well, those nearly 200 years of British rule left a profound and deeply complicated legacy that India is still navigating and dealing with today. The change was just stark. India went from being this global economic giant with a quarter of the world's GDP to being one of the poorest nations on Earth by the time of its independence in 1947. Its world-class industries were gone. But in a strange and complex paradox, the British, mostly for their own administrative convenience, had also unified this patchwork of kingdoms into a single political unit. They laid the groundwork, however unintentionally, for the modern nation-state of India that we see today. The story of colonial India is, at its heart, a story of a massive transfer of wealth and a deep, traumatic disruption of a society and an economy. It helps build modern Britain, there's no doubt about that. But it did so at the cost of impoverishing India for generations. And it leaves us with a really difficult question, one that echoes even today. When we look at the inequality we see in the world, how much of that is a direct result of this history? And what does that mean for all of us, living in the world that this empire helped create?